Hello. This week we're going to be looking at the Feast of Christ the King. This is the last Sunday of the Church's year. The Church's year actually begins with the preparation for Christmas, and the 4 weeks before Christmas will start soon. So we come to the end of a whole sequence of readings. Particularly we come to the end of the reading of St Matthew's Gospel, and we think about Jesus as Christ the King. It's a curious sort of concept in a democratic world to think about Jesus being a king, and we need to understand that it's an image that's being set before us, and that we, as with all images, we need to be able to sort of disabuse ourselves of some of the false notions we have. The sort of king that people were talking about when Jesus was referred to as a king in the scriptures, and when Jesus himself talks about kingship and the institution of a kingdom, is a kingdom in which there is a ruler who is able to exercise power and who is able to bring that power to bear in situations and cause things to happen. That's not our experience of kingship at all in the world. We live under a constitutional monarchy in this country, and so the king is a sort of symbolic figurehead. We're in danger if we think of God only as a symbolic figurehead. There's meant to be a more dynamic, a more powerful picture of what is happening. So let's try and unpack the image of what it means to talk about Jesus as a king. There are a number of different sorts of images of kingdom and kingship. One of them, of course, that features strongly in the Christmas story is those 3 wise men who come looking for a king. And that story in itself is interesting because it begins the life of Jesus as we look at it, recognizing that we look for kings in certain sorts of places and we don't find them. The 3 wise men come, and the first thing that happens to them is that they get lost. They get lost because they look for Jesus in the wrong place. They go to the palace of the king and they don't find him there. In fact, they don't find him until they find him really in the humblest place they possibly can, in a stable where he's just been born, in inadequate accommodation, living amongst the poorest of the poor. We don't find Jesus in the palaces of the rich. The second observation that we might make about a king really is that in these days perhaps we should not talk about Christ the King as Christ the President, Christ the Prime Minister maybe. That's the sort of image that appeals to us because our rulers are presidents and prime ministers rather than kings. As with our Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, or the American President who's about to come into power, Barack Obama, we understand that a ruler will be judged not by the pomp and circumstance that surrounds their office, but they are critiqued basically on whether they do what they say they will do. It's their actions that give them the critique. So the criticisms that are offered about current day rulers are they people who actually do what they say they're going to do? Barack Obama, for all his promise, will be judged as by whether he actually brings about this change that people so longingly look forward for when they voted for him. Finally, we see that today is about Christ the King, and in the story that we read today, the story which comes in Matthew chapter 25, it's a story about sheep and goats. We see a curious image of kingship. It's a sort of almost anonymous kingship. The king comes along and he separates his subjects, sheep and goats, and to one group he says, you have done what the king has commanded you, not because the king has forced you to do it, but because unbeknownst to you, you've actually done the right thing. They said, but how have we done the right thing? And he says, well, when you've cared for the poor, when you've cared for the naked, when you've cared for the hungry, when you've looked out for the homeless, and you've just done that, then that's the right thing to have done, and you've done it even though you haven't been commanded to do it. Equally well, he says to the people on the other side of the story, the goats in this story, that you haven't done the right thing. They say, but it's not that we haven't done the right thing, we haven't gone out and murdered people. He says, but insofar as you haven't cared for the poor, looked after the lonely, fed the hungry, given drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, that you actually haven't created the sort of world that the kingdom of God is supposed to be. In fact, I think this story is actually about these people. It's not, however else we might get caught up in the imagery, the story is actually about those people who are not allowed to be part of the kingdom of God because the sort of lifestyle that they've chosen, maybe it's a selfish lifestyle which is focused only on themselves, or an apathetic lifestyle in which they don't see the needs of the poor or anybody else for that matter. Those people, they find themselves outside the kingdom because of the sort of life that they've chosen to live. They've chosen to live outside the kingdom. What sort of person will we be? Where will we find Christ the King? This week, you might like to think about these ideas. Where is Christ? He's not in the place where we might expect to find him. He's going to be in an unusual place. The sorts of places where we tend to want to look are often just not the places where we find Christ at all. We will be judged not by what we say, but by our actions. And finally, it'll be the sort of choices we make to interact and to do genuinely those acts of kindness and graciousness that we should just do because of our humanity, to bring about on our own account the kingdom of heaven. That's what we're being asked to do. To look for Jesus where we don't expect to find him. To act in accordance with what we say. And to implement the sort of kingdom that God asks us to, that kingdom of forgiveness and love. Hope you have a good week in this week of Christ the King. Next week we'll be looking forward to the beginning of Advent. See ya.